seconds. Hi, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming, first and foremost, to this incredible panel discussion and a really exciting and ambitious mission and conversation that we're going to be having today. I'm so grateful to share this virtual space with the incredible likes of Fahd Ahmed, the Executive Director of Desis Rising Up and Moving, Kathy Dang, the Senior Advisor for the Center for Empowered Politics, Tenmori Soundararajan, the Executive Director of Equality Labs, and Seattle City Council Member Kshama Sawant. I think in thinking about what it means for South Asian folks to show up for Black people, I think the very first demand or the very first step is for people to be honest and reflective, both personally and historically. I often hear people in different non-Black communities of color say that, you know, anti-Blackness is ubiquitous, and it's really important for us to fight anti-Blackness within our communities and all of the ways that it shows up. But what I hear a lot less often is the specificity about those historical origins of anti-Blackness in these communities and the ideologies and the attitudes and all of the different ways that they manifest in both interpersonal and intercommunal interactions. So I'll give kind of two examples that I think are particularly formative in this discussion. I think first it's incredibly important to think about how structures of class, anti-Blackness, and colorism run parallel with structures of Brahminical supremacism and the oppression of Dalit communities particularly. Bab Saheb Ambedkar is a really important part of my political philosophy, and I think often about the correspondence the correspondence between him and W.E.B. Du Bois in 1946. Unfortunately, it didn't go beyond a single letter in each direction. But he contacted Du Bois to ask about the securing of minority rights in the United Nations, or through the United Nations, which is what Du Bois did with the National Negro Congress previously. He wrote that he was, quote, a student of the Negro problem, and that there is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and the position of the Negroes in America that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary. His work and the subsequent work of Dalit activists and organizers and feminists from groups like the Dalit Panthers in the 1970s to Dalit Women Fight in the present were actually my initial introduction for the real and radical potential for internationalist solidarities between South Asian and Black communities. So much so that the leader of the Dalit Panthers actually named his daughter Angela Davis. And further, where there is diasporic interaction, like in the Caribbean, I think it's really important to also think about the intersections of caste-based indentured labor and the transatlantic slave trade, particularly the British Empire's role in the transatlantic slave trade, both the kind of beginning of the slave trade and its abolition in November of 1844, the colonial British government in India legalized Indian emigration to Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guyana because the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished in England, and so they were no longer trafficking peoples from the African continent to the Caribbean. And so Indians primarily came to replace enslaved Black people across the British Empire. And this today is really the foundation for the fairly large population of Indo-Caribbean communities that continue to exist today in places like Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, as I said before. I think it's also incredibly important when we also think about migration to the United States and the kinds of logics that different communities were able to use in order to gain citizenship at a time when only white people were able to get citizenship. The ways that there were claims of Aryanism, and Aryanism is adjacent to whiteness. And so that is the foundation for the case for citizenship. I think it's incredibly important also to think about the nature of model minority communities, and even the stratification of South Asian communities within that structure of model minority, and the way that the trope of the ideal minoritized citizen is inherently anti-Black, because it's a structure that is a scramble from the bottom, right? It is an understanding that anti-Blackness is so central to the logics of settler colonialism, that if you are to be anything in the United States, the best you can be is at least not Black. So I think it's really important to think about those roots and those origins, although there is far more than what I explained in the short amount of time. And I think that that is where we ought to begin if we're going to think about solidarity, because it does not make any sense to align oneself with Black people fighting against anti-Blackness when there is not historical, personal, community accountability for the interactions with white supremacist, otherwise nationalistic and violent identity-based structures. And so I think that is the core of what I would like to say. I think we can pass on to our next guest.
Is that going to be me? Greetings. My name is Fahad. I am the director at Drum Desis Rising Up and Moving. We organize working class South Asian and Indo-Caribbean people in New York City on issues of immigrant rights, worker rights, racial justice, educational justice, gender justice, and global justice. And we are a mass-based organization. So that means we're like a community-based union. So our members are cab drivers, street vendors, domestic workers, restaurant workers, people that do work in their own homes, caring work, which is unpaid, and the children of those households. And for us, as working class people, a fundamental principle has always been that we don't have money. We're not represented in elected positions of power. And so the power of working class communities is in numbers and in our labor. And so how do we build our numbers? How do we build the capacities of our people to fight and engage in struggles around the issues that we work on? And amongst those issues is a lot of our focus is around policing, immigration, even around gender. A common theme is the relationship to law enforcement and systems of policing and militarism. And a lot of these systems that are inflicted upon us, and for working class communities, it's largely an infliction. And I think we have to be conscious of the fact that that may not be the case for all communities. For a lot of particularly economically and racially privileged communities who don't experience that, it means something different. But for us, it means the daily surveillance of Muslim communities. It means the stop and frisk of youth in our neighborhoods. It means the targeting of workers, particularly cab drivers and street vendors, from daily harassment, daily ticketing, and physical abuse. It is also the profiling and harassment of women that are trying to seek protection from domestic violence or gender violence, only to encounter abuse, harassment, and marginalization from the police, from the courts. And there's also the detention and deportation systems, which also includes the border walls. And so for us, we don't see the systems of policing, of detentions, of prisons as keeping us safe. We see them as the most major form of causing us harm. And this is in addition to the fact that these same systems in the forms of military are often the cause of us being forced to leave our homelands in the first place. Our communities would not be here if our homes had not been devastated by colonialism, continue to be devastated by modern forms of colonialism, by economic devastation, and by US military actions. And so we escape those systems of violence to come here and encounter new but similar sets of violence. And so for us, that raises the questions of how do we find safety? How do we build safety? And the conversation, much like what we're hearing across the country, is around divesting from these systems of policing, of enforcement, of militarism, and using that money to invest in systems that nurture, develop, and grow human beings individually and collectively. In New York City, a large number of people that face the violence from police and end up in prisons are either people that are homeless or people that are facing mental health issues. And so we're willing to police them and put them in prisons, but we are not willing to invest in mental health programs and invest in housing for those people, which would then create the conditions that they wouldn't have to encounter the police or the prisons. We could invest in their well-being and taking care of them. And so, this impacts our communities in all sorts of ways. Again, the surveillance of Muslim communities under the excuse of the war on terrorism, the targeting of poor people, the targeting of workers. And so for us, from our own experiences, the ideas of understanding the importance of divesting from police, they grow from our own experiences. And our own experiences are informed by knowing the histories and the current realities of other communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of workers, queer communities. And in particular, I think Black communities and Indigenous communities have always been a very important frame in Drum's work. Understanding very much as Zoe just talked about, that understanding who faces the largest brunt of the violence allows us, and centering that experience and that history allows us to understand the system in a much better place. That the system really cannot be changed, cannot be reformed unless the lived experiences of those who faced the greatest brunt of violence find liberation, find freedom, and are able to grow into healthy and nourished individuals and communities. So let's see, I have how much more time?
You could take as much time as you need, 3 to 4 minutes.
So I think a couple of minutes I want to take are just like in terms of examples, I talked about them generally, but I want to dig into like a couple of examples to like draw out how the relationship plays out. One is on the issues of immigration. More than 50% of our membership are undocumented. There have been 2 handfuls of immigration proposals that have come for legalization of undocumented peoples in the last 20 years, mainly in the last 16 years. Whenever those proposals have come and we've reviewed them with our members, kind of gone through the proposals, about 70 to 90% of our members would stand to benefit from those proposals. But consistently, our members have actually voted as an organization to stand against those proposals. Because in order to support those proposals, it would mean that we would get immigration papers that would be dripping in the blood of other immigrants who have already been criminalized, of immigrants that are crossing the borders, of communities that live on the border, of indigenous communities that live on the border. Because those proposals say that we will criminalize those people and in exchange give you papers. And when presented with that decision, the praxis of solidarity has meant that we will not take those papers if they're tainted with the blood of our siblings and of our loved ones. Another example is on the issues of bullying. Bullying is, I think, a particularly an issue that gets a lot of attention in Arab, Muslim, South Asian, and queer communities. And the response from a lot of our communities is our children should not be bullied, and there should be zero tolerance for bullying. And that part is right, that there shouldn't be bullying. But in asking for zero tolerance against bullying, what our own communities are doing are actually inviting the police into the schools to resolve those issues of bullying. And in doing so, further perpetrating the school to prison pipeline, which disproportionately targets Black, Latino, disabled youth. And so we see in these ways and how the interests of our communities, if we are very short-sighted, our interests come at the expense of other communities. And what we try to do in Drum is, how do we reconcile the contradictions that exist across our communities and seek solutions that both provide a pathway to liberation for our communities and fundamentally center the experiences of the communities that are most marginalized at the same time and set them on the path towards liberation. So, you know, right now, as the case in Minneapolis, there's been a lot of conversations around the police officer being Asian, particularly Hmong. And so that's been a conversation in Asian and Hmong communities. The business owner that called the police being Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim. And so lots of conversations in Arab, Palestinian, and Muslim communities. And many activists have this tendency to just be like, I can't believe our people do that. How could they become police officers? How could they, you know, call the police? But in doing that, we're not really acknowledging sort of the challenges of, well, what are the real job opportunities that are available to our communities if they come here as refugees? What are the job opportunities when the degrees and the experiences people had back home are not recognized here, and the only opportunities they have are to run small businesses? And so this ends up being like a hypercritical perspective. On the other extreme is providing excuses for those things. Okay, so if people are doing small business, that doesn't mean that they get to be abusive, exploitative, racist in doing so. And with police, you know, okay, that's the job that you found, but it is, at the end of the day, it's still, policing as a job serves a racist and classist function in American society. And you can say whatever you want and have whatever feelings you want about that, but that part remains a reality. And so how do we reconcile those differences? And so again, like, you know, a lot of our work has been around trying to do recruitment. Police try to do a lot of recruitment in our communities and military, and we do counter-recruitment programming, talking to youth, talking to families around why not to join the police, why not to join the military, what are the lies that they tell, what are the positions that they put people in, and what would be alternative employment opportunities that are available to our folks. And so the last sentence I would say is, in order to be able to actually reach those higher levels of solidarity, to be able to resolve the contradictions, we actually have to be in solidarity with our own communities. We have to understand what their material conditions and their histories are, and understand the material histories and conditions of other communities, and then figure out how are we going to reconcile the contradictions that exist across them. If we're not doing that, then we're just resorting to individualism and moralism. Individually, I can say and do whatever, but that won't really make things better for Black communities or for Indigenous communities if I say that I'm taking this position. I have to figure out how do I redirect the future and liberation of my communities to be aligned with and promoting the liberation of other communities. Thank you.
So then it's just a quick question. You know, it basically becomes a matter of reconceptualizing public safety, right? About thinking about a notion of safety and community that is inclusive and complementary, as opposed to both individually, personally, and communally self-serving.
Exactly. I think that's perfectly stated. I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Next, we have Kathy Dang.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be on this call with all of you this Friday evening. I'm Kathy Dang. I use she, her, they, them pronouns. I am Senior Advisor with Center for Empowered Politics, and I'm the former Director of CAV, Organizing Asian Communities in New York City. And I was asked to speak about my experience as a Director of CAV, but also my work right now of taking on the right wing and the growing, very vocal right wing within all of our communities. But more specifically, I'm going to talk about Chinese right wing communities. In 2014, Akai Gurley was killed by former NYPD officer Peter Liang and Sean Landau when they were conducting a vertical patrol. And in New York City, what that means is that the cops and NYPD start at the very top level of a public housing building, and then they work their way down to the staircase. Liang, coming down the staircase, fired an accidental discharge into the darkness when he heard a door closing and was scared. He immediately called his union rep along with Landau, but didn't check to see if he hurt anybody. He really later realized that there was a screaming from down the stairs, and it was Melissa Butler, Akai Gurley's friend, who was frantically trying to perform CPR on Akai. And they came down the stairs and stood there as Melissa, who was untrained in CPR, provided CPR through a 911 operator. And I think this case is actually not that far off from the image that we're seeing with Tao, the Hmong cop from Minnesota, who just stood there and didn't do anything to stop his colleagues from killing George Floyd. And so, you know, there were all these memes and messages around how, you know, his staying there is reminiscent of Asians being complicit in upholding white supremacy. With Peter Liang, during that time in 2015, he was indicted, and that was when several white officers were not indicted, including Darren Wilson in the killing of Michael Brown, Dan Pantaleo in the killing of Eric Gardner. So Liang being indicted here in New York with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, by Ken Thompson, who was the DA, he was then labeled a scapegoat. You know, why is this Asian officer being indicted when white cops across the country were not? But the problematic and troubling situation was that the Chinese folks who were standing behind Peter Liang used ethno-nationalism to galvanize across the country to support Peter Liang. And there was a spectrum of beliefs, everything from, and so there's factions, everything from he was wrong, but he shouldn't have been indicted. Some believe he didn't do anything wrong, that it was an accident. But ultimately, we believe that he was standing there and didn't perform CPR and didn't do his duty as a trained officer to save Akai's life. And now Akai's family is left without a brother, a partner, you know, a son, a nephew. So, and during that time, what we saw was that a lot of politicians and political opportunists were standing behind Peter Liang. And what's so frustrating is that all these political opportunists and politicians are now riding the Bernie Sanders AOC progressive wave and you know, going to rallies calling for accountability of the officers who killed Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And they are coming off as progressives in reforms around police accountability at New York State, on the New York State level. And while we understand that, you know, elected officials are moving targets, they were nowhere to be found back then, and left me out to dry, an organization, our CAV organization, out to dry on our own, isolated, experiencing the backlash all on our own. And so CAV, we were harassed, we were trolled, we were threatened, I was doxxed. And it was a really hard, challenging time internally in our conversations with our membership. We didn't do the work that we need to do to move our members along and seeing why this case was important, why we had to stand in solidarity, and that police killings are a systemic issue, a systemic problem that we have to unite with Black folks in addressing and fighting. And the organizations that are actually putting out statements now too, a lot of the East Asian organizations that we're seeing are putting out statements calling for the defunding of NYPD, and they were nowhere to be found back then either. And now suddenly are taking strong stance and positions around defunding the police across the country and reallocating to social services. And what I've also noticed is those organizations that are saying defund the NYPD, fund social services, and like youth and community development are nowhere to be found around affirmative action and the specialized high school testing reform in New York City, where Asian and South Asian students are being used as a wedge on keeping the tests as is for the specialized high schools in New York City. And that period of time that we lived through that, the right-wing forces that we were up against built a national infrastructure of mostly Chinese immigrants who are middle class and upper middle class. And they built on a national infrastructure to carry the same level of mobilization on affirmative action and opposition to data segregation, which Southeast Asian communities were putting forth in many states across the US. And in my interviews and my learning lessons with some of the case studies I was doing with the groups who are doing data segregation and affirmative action, is that we did not anticipate this level of opposition. We really thought that our only opposition was the NYPD, the police union, and the DA. We also had to then take on this new growing force that were really vocal and loud. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of them were middle class and upper middle class. The calls that we were getting in New York City weren't just in New York, it came from Seattle, from LA. The biggest hubs are actually Seattle, LA, and the Bay. And then some hub in Ohio, where a lot of them are professors and scientists. And in the political education we were doing with our members all these years, even before the case, we've always tried to build a strong class analysis around how the cops are there to protect the wealthy and protect capital. We'd make the correlation between, how the cops were brought in to always break up our protests, or when a tenant had an issue with the landlord and called the cops, and they would come, they always sided with the landlord. And even when we did all that political education, it didn't move our membership. But the ethno-nationalists and Chinese right, their agenda actually hurts Chinese people too. And it hurts working class people. Another example are there's a fight in Little Saigon in Orange County where Vietnamese owners are fighting to reopen their stores, but without the proper protection for the workers. And so they'll use racism and ethno-nationalism, they'll claim that, but in reality, it actually stifles our own communities and hurts us too. What I'm realizing, so with all of our different Pan-Asian communities, whether you're Southeast Asian or South Asian, East Asian, there's so many differences within our communities. But one thing that I found certain in our fights is that there's always these cis men in our communities who have individualist and political agendas. And they will use their toxic masculinity to lead their followers to go after leaders of progressive and leftist work. Oftentimes are women, queer and trans folks who are leading the work. And even if men stand up, they don't target cis men the same way they target queer, trans, folks and women, you know, myself being one of them. And we're seeing it again in the Midwest, where Southeast Asian Hmong women who are on the forefront are being targeted by Hmong men and Southeast Asian men. And they think that we are getting in their way of their self-interest, but the reality is it's actually the system that's getting in their way, whether it's their, you know, a seat at higher education or loans for what they may need for their businesses or political power. It's not us getting in their way. And so, you know, how the model minority works is like, you know, we're put in a position right now to uphold this structure at the expense of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, and to uphold white supremacy. And well, last thing I'll share is there was a question around, you know, how do we build safety within our community? How do we prepare our communities for safety? And I have had so many learning lessons and learning regrets from my work on the Kaigerli case, mainly that, you know, we try to reframe and package words with our membership in different ways and tried to present it in different ways, but it wasn't landing. And so we have to make sure that we are always prepared for opposition and have strong organized communities with deep political education that's ongoing and consistent and in collaboration with other organizations. We have to make sure that we actually educate elected officials. Some elected officials were really confused by the Desis segregation fights, like Southeast Asians versus Chinese folks, like Asians versus Asians. And so they were completely confused, and the bill didn't even move forward because of all the confusion with elected officials. We have to build and invest in immigrant progressive leadership. They have to be on the forefront leading this work. So you know, I think a lot of times, like second generation or the folks who are born here, we can't speak to the immigrant base in the same way, or because we were educated here. So we can't, oftentimes what we say doesn't resonate and land. And I've been seeing all these conversations, or seeing a lot of folks talk about having conversations with families. And that is important, but not for the sake of just having conversation with families. It is for the purpose that we commit to neutralizing. If we cannot move them, we neutralize our families. Because what we saw in the Kaigerli case is that a lot of movement people, their family members are going to Peter Liang rallies. And we weren't doing the work in our homes to neutralize our family members. And they go out there, then they'll get pulled into the fights around affirmative action and the specialized high school testing reform. So I'll end with that like we have the duty and responsibility to move, if not neutralize our folks, so they don't continue to uphold the structure that we have now.
I wanted to ask you a question about whether you think there are, I mean, you mentioned really critically, you know, the number of, you know, non-white men who are joining the far right. And I was wondering if you think that there's kind of a relationship or parallel between like this idea that policing is something that is important to do to keep our communities safe, and the kind of individualist ethos that leads these men to join the far right, because ultimately it seems like it's like parallel, right? Like it's moving in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are no, like I think Fahad said earlier, there is no sense of alternatives for our communities to see what safety looks like and what models there are that exist for them to build in what community accountability and safety looks like. So for example, in the work we did with organizing tenants, there was one tenant that really harassed everybody else. And we had to talk to tenants about not calling the police on that one tenant. And then how can we build the agreements and accountability within that one building? But how do we do that to scale? And so I think that's a big missing piece in our work right now, is building models and alternatives for our own communities to see as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Unless anyone else had, Fahad, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think just briefly to add is there are some of those histories that our communities come from back home, right? So, you know, I think there's, for South Asia, there's Gulabi Gang, where women, a lot of times Dalit women, mostly Dalit women, have self-organized to form women's protection groups and figured out ways of keeping safety and like women banding together to build that safety. There's definitely histories of different communities. I think probably like the most easily accessible examples are in Sikh communities where they have organized in moments of riots, of kind of when communal tensions are happening, to like serve as barriers to like protect people and provide safety. And you know, there are these traditions, and I'm sure Tanmori can speak to a lot more examples. That there are these histories, you know, like the way that we morally think of police, it didn't exist a few decades ago in our home countries. So there are different ways of like keeping people safe, but we have to invest in them, and that actually requires having the resources, and those resources being taken away from police the way that they exist now.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such a good point, thinking about the fact that like policing as we know it is a colonial construction that was mostly used to kind of suppress the movement, the organization, the agency of oppressed, colonized, enslaved, and otherwise communities. And I think that we can really think towards alternative models of safety if we think outside of what the colonial episteme has forced us to imagine constitutes safety. Next, we have Tanmori.
All right. Hey, everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, good. So I think those are actually some great, points to which help me kind of think through some of the things that I want to help everybody to think about. And I think one of the things that, if you've been following Equality Labs for a while, we really want South Asians at this moment to make these connections between what it is to be working class and what it is to be caste oppressed, and how South Asian as a category is really a category that has all of these internal tensions and hegemonies related to caste and geography and language and class, but also that informs then how we pursue white adjacency as we start to pursue the immigrant, dream or the model minority dream in the United States. And I think that, what I really would want to leave everybody here who's listening to consider is that, every time you see an upper caste South Asian person talking about defending Black lives and writing and becoming a massive influencer and about all of the ways that they're going to show up for Black people, the number one thing caste oppressed people think is, where were you for thousands of years while we were being oppressed by Brahmanism? And I think this is a really critical piece for us as we start to think about what does it mean for us to decolonize, is that for us as South Asians, one of our first steps is actually to de-Brahmanize, because everything about the understanding of color, how we understand social and cultural hegemonies is first informed by Brahmanism in the subcontinent. And every interaction that we have with, communities of the African diaspora are informed by that, because our anti-Dalitness very much informs our anti-Blackness. And I think that the thing that I'm so struck by is that, you will have, people just all over the place, all of a sudden, understanding that we need to talk about abolition and, it's wrong that we're participating in racist structures. But think about the fact that South Asia has its own African diaspora. How many times have you actually heard of someone who is of the African diaspora be given a platform inside any of our South Asian countries? And I really want to emphasize that the reason why more people don't talk about the African diaspora in our region is because of our anti-Blackness. And so I think that, you know, we have a bunch of roles that I think Fahad and Kathy spoke to, which is as we begin to come into formation and join movements for police abolition, we also have our own deep work to do to de-Brahmanize our understandings of who we are as a people, think about moving from performative and superficial understandings of colorism to structural understandings of anti-blackness and anti-Dalitness as it shows up in our institutions, and to really consider deeply how the police really show up both for our communities back home in South Asia and also in the United States are inherently violent colonial structures that do nothing but oppress and exploit the lives of our communities. And, you know, Zoe had this like really great interview that she did about looting with an author whose specialty is about looting. And, you know, again, all of the things that we know that come to define the police in South Asia, the blueprint comes from English colonialism. So whether it's the actual term loot, which first appeared like in an Englishman's police book, or even fingerprinting. Fingerprinting was, you know, really came from the colonial Raj because they could not actually identify brown people from brown people. So it was easy for them to figure out the handprint as a way to distinguish between their subjects. But also in terms of the ways that we understand that we need to criminalize that which we exploit. And I think that's why when you talk to Dalits or caste oppressed people in India, there is never a doubt that the police is the violent mechanism for which caste impunity continues. In fact, so many people, and the question and the pursuit of impunity is felt so deeply by, you know, caste oppressed people across South Asia. We want the rule of law to be implemented. And I think that when our communities see the global rise of Black liberation, our goal is to really be in alignment and be in formation, because when we defend Black lives, the things that we have to do to organize our trifling South Asian butts who are so interested too often in white adjacency than actually true liberation, we will actually unearth all that's not necessary. And I think that's part of what I really want to encourage people to do, is think about what are the trifling ways that you are pushing nonsense by continuing superficial ideas of South Asian cultural identities that push hegemonies of caste and therefore, you know, continue racist paradigms. And also this piece around the structural is so critical because, one, we need to stop all of these community association gatherings where people are clapping themselves on the back and saying, let's have better police reform. We don't need that. We do not need to reform violent institutions. We do not need to reform institutions that are part of Black death. Would you want that reformation? If you had a family member died, how would you reform that? You can't reform a fucking machine gun. Take it down, right? That's the call right at this moment. And if you aren't taking it with that severity, then you really are on the wrong train here. And you are standing in the way and slowing down a movement that is trying to allow life to flourish. And so I really want to encourage everyone that is part of these South Asian associations that are now having all of these politicians, tell them, block them, and move them to abolition. That is your #1 job right now. Your second job is to get educated and stop posting on Instagram and fucking read. Learn about Ambedkar. Learn about caste abolitionist practices. Learn about the safety practices caste oppressed and other religious oppressed minorities have had to do because the police have decimated our communities. All you have to do is look at Kashmir and the Northeast and the preponderance of caste oppressed and religious minorities that are in prison in India today. There is even, you know, such a commonality of police framing our people when we go to try to report crimes of atrocity that we even have a name for it. It's called lie case or poi case. So I just want people to get real about what this moment is. This is not a revolution for Instagram. This is a movement of revolution. And that requires you to move everything that is not necessary and come to the table, right? Or don't come to the table at all. And then the other piece I think that is really critical, and Zoe, I'm gonna pass the pass the mic off because I'm getting heated over here, is that we also have a structural responsibility as South Asians to really come for our fucking Hindu nationalist relatives, because those people are not just sitting around, sending obnoxious WhatsApp messages and being like, oh, Modi is so great. They're also mobilizing Hindu nationalist electoral power to move and get Trump back into office. So your second major job as a Desi on the line right here is to come for your saffron auntie and uncle, because those people are not casual fascists. And I know that it's deeply uncomfortable, and I know it means you're gonna have to upset the table and there might be sambar and rice on the floor. Who the fuck cares? We're here to defend Black life. We do not care about your discomfort. We care about preserving life and allowing all of us to be here free. So what that means is anytime you get a WhatsApp message saying, oh, the temple is going to be doing a session for Republican candidates, or oh, Steve Bannon, who is the honorary co-chair of the Republican Hindu Coalition, who is mobilizing and doing sessions with Shalabh Kumar, again, head of the Republican Hindu Coalition, these people are mobilizing the right wing in our community, not just to build Hindu nationalist power, but also to basically uplift white nationalist structural power. So I don't want anybody here to be putting up an Instagram photo about, save Black lives or defend Black lives if you haven't done that first job by disrupting your saffron auntie and uncle. You need to be the most unpopular person in your family circle that's fascist until they actually give in to you and say, okay, fuck it, I'm not going to join them, because they don't want to hear you stop talking. And that's the kind of revolution that we need. We can no longer sit on the sidelines and nurse some pathetic, superficial wounds about colorism and who's wearing a bindi, or, I forgot that dumbass, singer who's like, oh my God, did she wear a sari? That is not structural power. Structural power is us coming into alignment with an internationalist vision that understands we can take up a vision for true multiracial justice and pick up where neoliberalism failed and bring us a radical revolution. But it only comes from you risking and from standing in solidarity with people that are risking their lives, their families, and their destinies, because this moment, as scary as it is, will only be changed by organizing, will only be changed by acts of courage, and will only be changed by people who are here on this call that are willing to take the call from Black movements to take seriously that is Black life more important to you than your discomfort? And I would argue without question, yes, it is, and that each and every one of you need to take the call and stand up.
I do have a follow-up, but I know that Shama needs to say the things that we are very excited to hear her say. So I will ask you the question after she says her word. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This is such a fascinating and extremely important discussion, and I apologize in advance that I have to leave early. But it's so timely that we're talking about this, obviously, because we are in the midst of a historic uprising, a rebellion of an entire generation of young people, obviously led by Black and brown communities, but with tremendous solidarity across the working class and across cities. I mean, one of the most moving moments I had was when I saw a video footage of a major rally in Boise, Idaho. I mean, this is indeed a nationwide uprising, and we're seeing solidarity rallies, big ones across the world as well. And as Faz mentioned, this is raising real questions about how we fight against oppression, and raises the questions of how we build solidarity across communities of color, immigrant communities, and really brings up the question of working class solidarity across race, national origin, and gender. And I wanted to touch on this in a second. And I also agree with Tanmui that this really does bring up the question of are we actually going to build a movement? And I agree 100%. It is about getting organized. It's about showing courage. It's about getting, sort of taking it as a badge of honor. If you are making people in power, people who are unwilling to budge, if you're making them uncomfortable, take that as a badge of honor and unabashedly fighting for a different kind of society and getting organized. And really that also brings up the question of, can we have a society free of police? And I really agree with that point, but I wanted to bring that from a socialist analysis lens. But just to begin with, I mean, just what the movement right now is fighting for also is extremely important, because we can only build stronger movements and build stronger organizing if we are able to build on victories. And right now, just to give you a sense of what's happening in Seattle right now, we are fighting to ban the use and purchase of chemical weapons and the so-called crowd control weapons, banning chokeholds. We have no illusion that simply banning is going to be in itself in any, going to be enough, but it's important that we take up the concrete demands that are coming out from the movement. And that's what on Monday afternoon, the city council will be voting on 2 of these bills from me, banning chemical weapons and chokeholds, and we'll see what they actually do. And to give you a sense of how much solidarity there is with the Black Lives Matter movement right now on the ground here, for 10 straight days and nights, the city establishment led by Democratic establishment Mayor Jenny Durkan has inflicted horrific violence and brutality against this peaceful protest movement, as I said, led by communities of color, but joined through a multiracial working class solidarity of young people here. And I was there with them on Sunday night. It was like a war zone. One moment we were having peaceful political conversations a few feet from the police lines, who were armed to the teeth with their riot gear, their tear gas canisters, and their flashbang grenades, and it was incredible. The next moment we were being inflicted with mace and tear gas, and there is so much solidarity in the community that there is now a campaign demanding that Mayor Jenny Durkan, a Democratic mayor, keep in mind, resign, for how this is at her doorstep. This horrific violence is at her doorstep. And then building on these demands, of course, we're also talking about taking away 50% of the Seattle police bloated budget and dedicating that to community efforts for restorative justice, for affordable housing, for services for the homeless, and so on. I mean, there's so much is underfunded or unfunded. Even though the city is so wealthy, we're spoiled for choices. And then we really, as Kathy and other speakers mentioned, there's a culture of impunity in the police departments, and it's not just a Seattle story. It is a story of virtually every city in the United States, where Black and brown people, and also our homeless neighbors, people who are facing mental illness, have not only been hurt and harmed, but actually murdered by the police. And not one single police officer has been brought to justice. We have to strike a blow. Using this historic movement, we have to strike a blow at that impunity. And that is why it is important to take up the demand concretely from the movement for Black Lives from several years ago, to fight for and win an independently elected community oversight board with full powers over the police, including hiring, firing, subpoena powers, and bringing the police officers to justice. Just to give you a sense of why, unless you have this kind of independent authority where the voters and ordinary people have control themselves over the police, that there is no alternative to that, is that even though this is a city controlled by the Democratic establishment, since this mayor, who's now become extremely unpopular and people are demanding that she resign, since she took office in 2017, 8 Black and brown people have been murdered by the police. And again, as I said, not a single police officer being held accountable. And so I think for our movement, it's really important to develop clarity. And so these discussions are like the one we're having right now are crucial. We need more of these discussions. As Kathy correctly said, we are going to see, and we're already seeing this, a field day of political opportunists, politicians. Now that there's a shift in society, there's a real historic shift with this movement really demanding justice and spreading like wildfire throughout the world. We are going to see no end of attempts to co-opt the movement. Now, at the national level, we saw corporate politicians like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. I mean, just such a spectacle, taking a knee for 9 minutes. But we have to recognize that no amount of African kente cloth is going to cover up the Democratic Party's historic complicity in oppressing communities of color. It was stunning to see even Joe Biden daring to address George Floyd's daughter at his funeral, even though he did not even apologize to her for his role as a key architect of the modern and deeply racist mass incarceration system. So it is so crucial for our movement to have a very, this is a fundamental question: who's on our side and who's not, and also drawing the connections with capitalism itself. And just to give you a more local example, right now we have all these Democratic Establishment Council members talking about how Black Lives Matter, talking about dismantling and reimagining the police. I mean, all kinds of rhetorical flourishes. These are the same council members who 2 years ago, when the Black community was pleading, absolutely pleading with them to vote no on a racist police contract, they all voted yes. And unfortunately, I was the only no vote. And what's striking about this is that we had a majority people of color city council at that time, and yet we had one no vote from my office. That really shows that ultimately, without developing a class analysis, we are not going to be able to achieve success, let alone really fight for a different kind of society altogether. And that's why, first of all, I think our movements need independent leadership and democratic structures to hold all kinds of leaders, not just politicians, but also people who will move into leadership in the movement. We need to hold all of them accountable. And ultimately, we are not going to be able to accomplish this whole project of social change unless we also call for a new party of the working class. Our movements need our own parties because the corporate parties are not working for us. And we need a party that will stand unambiguously with working class communities, with marginalized communities, with communities facing violence, and fight against the racist and sexist agenda of capitalism. And concretely in Seattle, where also, in addition to the police brutality related demands that the movement is bringing, we're also seeing incredible unity among ordinary people, in the movement, activists, around the demand to tax big businesses like Amazon so that we can fund social housing. Fahad and others were talking about how these same communities who face just the horrific brunt of police violence are also the same communities who are facing the brunt of just unspeakable economic devastation under capitalism. I mean, in Seattle, for example, which is a very wealthy city, but deeply unequal, even before this pandemic recession, we have had an epidemic of evictions. And who do you think has been the most affected by that disproportionately? Obviously, our Black and brown communities, especially African-American women-led working class and poor households. And now, in the context of the recession, we are going to see an absolute tsunami of evictions unless we build and organize renter struggles and connect that to the questions of police violence, because those two things, the economic devastation and police brutality, they're not happening on different planets. They're both products of this deeply unequal and unjust system. And I could not agree more. I mean, as a socialist, I think we absolutely have to fight for a society free of police, free of racism, and it is connected. It is related to having a strong class analysis and understanding that the primary function of the police under capitalism is to protect capital, to protect the billionaire class. To quote Malcolm X, we are going to need international working class solidarity because, as he said, you cannot have capitalism without racism. And so I totally agree that concepts like model minority are completely abhorrent to any kind of anti-racism. And we need to build that working class solidarity because we need to point out that our fight is with the billionaire class and their system, because they need racism and other forms of oppression to keep capitalism propped up. And so, in my view, in order to win that kind of society where there is no police, there is no oppression, we will need a socialist transformation of the global society. It cannot happen on the basis of capitalism. We need a society that is based on equality and cooperation. And that's only possible if the world's resources and the major corporations are democratically owned and controlled by us, by workers, by ordinary people in the community. And to achieve that, of course, we are going to need, there are no shortcuts. We are going to need to keep getting organized. And we're going to need a socialist revolution in order to actually build that kind of society that we are fighting for. And last, I'll just add that I really also agree. I mean, the idea of socialist transformation is inherently an international idea because capitalism is a global system, and our interests as American working class and Black and brown communities are tied not with other Americans who are billionaires or who are wealthy, but with working class people across national borders, in Brazil and India. And so the oppression of Black people in the US may have different specific features than the oppression of Dalits in India, but it is the same root. It's the poisoned fruit of a poisoned system, and that entire system needs to be eliminated and replaced with a different kind of society, and I would say a socialist society. And that's why the fight for socialism also has to be international.
Can I quickly ask you a question? You were talking about the need for these material reforms. How do we ensure that those material reforms around, defunding don't become reformist ends to themselves? How do we ensure that those materialist moves keep this abolition?
I think that's a crucial question you have asked. And first of all, just stepping back, it's of fundamental importance that we have to educate one another in the movement, and we have to educate young activists who are coming into the movement. This may be their first political experience, that capitalism is not a system that can be reformed. Capitalism has to be dismantled, and we need a socialist transformation of society. At the same time, I think we have to understand that it is not enough. For example, just speaking of myself as socialist and my organization, Socialist Alternative, which is a Marxist organization, we cannot, it would be an abdication of responsibility on our part if we simply said, here's our vision for a future society, now, let's do it. We have to engage in the real life struggle around the demands that people are bringing up, and the way we fight for reforms and the clarity we provide in the fight for reforms goes hand in hand with also providing a vision for a future society. So just to make it very concrete, let's talk about defunding the police by at least 50%. Is that going to abolish the police? Absolutely not. It is a reform. There is no question about that. We have to be very crystal clear about that. But the first point I'll make is that there is no universe in which we are going to easily win anything like defunding. I mean, just to put a fine point on it, I've been on the city council for 6 years. This is my 7th year. Every year through our People's Budget campaign, we have brought forward concrete proposals for defunding the police. Every year, the bourgeois establishment has rejected it, and every year we have lost. So the first thing we need to understand, again, as people who are fighting not to reform, but to dismantle the system, is that winning these reforms themselves is going to be a hard fight, and it's and we can help through the process of fighting for those reforms, clarify that our fight is against the existence of the system itself. And that's why which reforms we fight around is critical. That's why as a socialist, I don't make, I don't use, and a socialist elected representative, I don't use very radical language and then point towards very minor changes. What we do is take up reforms that are inherently going to be difficult to achieve without that kind of clarity, without that kind of organizing. And inevitably, this kind of fight will point towards the need for a different, for a non-reformist agenda. But we also have to understand that unless those of us who agree that we need a fundamental transformation of society also throw ourselves into the struggle for reforms, we will not be able to win over the masses of people that we need to in order to go towards a non-reformist agenda.
Thank you so much. Tanmori, I actually wanted to follow up with you about something that you were saying about Hindu nationalism and the connections between those structures on the subcontinent in South Asia and here in the United States. You're talking about fingerprinting made me think about facial recognition software, and made me think about, South Asian engineers in Silicon Valley and their participation in tech fascism there. I mean, I was really kind of interested in hearing how you thought about that coalescence of politics. I remember, I think Modi came to the Bay, and the first time I met you was in the Bay doing work with Dalit Women Fight. And so I'm interested in kind of maybe Silicon Valley as this symbolic, coming together of these different forces around like gendered violence, Hindu nationalism, Brahminical supremacy, and yeah.
Well, I think that what's really important is that, you know, a huge portion of our community actually does make up the tech power in Silicon Valley. And I think this is a really moral call to action for anyone that's an engineer or a developer at Facebook or Twitter or any of these companies that benefit off of surveillance capitalism. The reality is that you too are also contributing to Black death, because the carcerality that many of these systems provide is something that you're a contributor to. And I think, you know, of course, like many of our community members are on H-1B visas, so they don't have all of the possibilities for the kind of active protest that a citizen might. But I think this is the time to be part of the fifth column in your companies and raise the issues that are important to Black communities. And that would be one, why are these companies allowing right-wing, you know, trolls to basically deplatform leading Black and women of color leaders all across the world? Because anti-Blackness and Islamophobia sells, and they get to make money off of atrocity. So I think there's a really key thing that you need to push, you know, Jack and Mark about, which is, why are you disrupting democracy? Get your shit together and come for your fucking engineers and deal with that. So that's something that you could do internal to the companies, because the more that they hear internal employee pressure that this is wrong and that you are leading to carceral institutions, that's very, very, very important. But I also think I wanted to also pick up on something that Fahad said, because, you know, Fahad always like helps to recontextualize our own history as South Asians in ways that are empowering. When I sometimes I feel like, oh, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. He reminds us of what's powerful in terms of what we can lift up. And I think this is really, and that's really about the community safety models we have in our own legacies. And, you know, I think for every crappy story that we have about the colonial Indian force, and there's many people here who are listening and watching who are from the Northeast or the Kashmir or Chhattisgarh, or who've experienced the internal Indian military force as an occupying force, where it's seeing Muslims and Kashmiris and Dalits as colonial subjects to the, you know, the idea of the Indian state. And I think that the response has been that caste oppressed people and religious minorities come up and have always come up with alternative models for safety. So for example, there's this really incredible Dalit leader from Kerala named Ayan Kali, who was this fierce advocate. And, you know, at that time, just like now, you had upper caste people setting fire to Dalit homes, raping Dalit women, you know, beating and physically brutalizing Dalits that would dare cross the apartheid lines in villages. And Ayan Kali was like such an incredible thinker. He was like, if they throw a fire on our house, I'm going to throw a fire on their house. But more importantly, you know, he was really specific about the fact that we need a system of justice where we can really truly get justice. So he moved beyond these ideas of protecting and defending, you know, and I always think of him very similar to the Colombo movement, in that he was like, we will create our own separate schools. We will create our own separate courts for justice. We will hear our own cases. And he built an alternative system that wasn't about policing, but was about adjudicating justice. And I think about that also with the Gulabi Gang and also the Dalit Panthers. And the Dalit Panthers were so deeply informed by the Black Panthers and seeing the struggles of Black people. And it was happening at a time when atrocity in Maharashtra was just off the chain. And you have to keep in mind that many of the Black Panthers, in addition to being activists, were also poets and thinkers and visionaries at a time, thinking about what would internationalism, that going beyond these violent systems, look like. And they would lead marches around the bodies of people who were the murdered by caste atrocity, and those marches were there to prevent the people who had actually caused that violence, to try to remove the evidence and remove those bodies. So they would do that until there would be some sort of a case. So there are histories that we have that are right for this moment within the South Asian community, but to do that, we actually need upper caste people to take 10 seats and then some, and stop bringing up ahimsa and stop bringing up Gandhi, because those are nonsense solutions to a time when we actually need to have oppressed people see each other, hear from each other, and build with each other with meaning. And a lot of the attempt of like neoliberal interference of upper caste voices trying to dominate this space that haven't done this work, that's really a key part of this. Because when you hear the work of Fahad or Kathy or Dalit activists who have confronted the police back at home, this is not work that's easy. This is work that is incredibly brutalizing. This is work that puts your family and life in danger, because when you challenge the police, you are challenging the state. And the state is the ultimate perpetrator in all of these contexts. And so what we're trying to think about, you know, with whatever political ideology people are coming to this place, is what is the form of collective governance where we can center collectivity and justice and love and empathy and compassion. And I think those are the questions we need to ask ourselves, because we don't have to have the big picture answer. I think what we need is lots of experimentation. That's actually how the Project NIA got to the place where they, by practicing, and I always remember reading about the intervention that BYP 100 did about putting together people that had been harmed in the process of rape, and what it meant to actually bring transformative justice. To invest in processes of TJ as opposed to taking photo ops with police is really freaking difficult. You know, and I say this because one of the biggest sets of institutions in the South Asian community that collaborate with the police are domestic violence institutions. And as someone who works with survivors, this is such an urgent issue for me, because many of our survivors require police reports in order to file for those visas that allow you to escape your perpetrator. So there's some process as an immigrant where you're forced to try to figure out ways to engage with the state at a time when you're most harmed and most vulnerable. But that said, I think just because we don't have a long road to abolition doesn't mean we don't start trying, doesn't mean we don't start experimenting. And if you think about, like, I remember that experiment that BYP 100 did, yeah, I remember reading it, and the thing that stuck to me was that it cost $35,000 to deal with the issue of to bring addressing the harm of rape to this one couple or this one interaction. And I thought about, wow, and most people said like $35,000, that's so unrealistic. And the thing that I wanted to think about was like how atrophied people's revolutionary imaginations were, because the burden of the pain and the violence and the trauma of rape is held by survivors. Think about how many billions of dollars survivors and their families actually have to hold, and imagine if we had it as community institutions. So I just wanted to bring that up because, again, we have so many roles as South Asians that we can play in this conversation around police abolition. You know, stopping Hindu nationalists from aligning with white nationalists, being that unpopular person that shuts that down, being part of police abolitionist efforts, and then working with South Asian institutions so that we don't become the brown reform roadblock into the path towards abolition. So even if that means you just stay quiet and listen, that's really great, because then we don't hear Gandhi and Ahimsa, which we don't need right now. So I just really want to encourage people to take this moment that, you know, if listen, and do not, if you say with the word reform, you're already wrong. So just, if it's coming into there, just stop that. And then start listening to people who say abolition. And this is a great time to be a learning movement. We don't need an influencer movement. We need a learning and listening movement. So let's do that. We can build that together.
You said it all. Before I get to a couple of questions, on the topic of Gandhi, briefly, I do just want to remind that the kind of mobilization of Satyagraha came from the fact that he was resentful that Indians in apartheid South Africa were classified so close to Black natives. And so his nonviolent civil disobedience was an attempt to mobilize anti-Blackness in order to curry favor with the Afrikaner nationalist structure, or the kind of apartheid structures that were in South Africa. So I often see, you know, Gandhi coming up and in these kind of intercommunal, peaceful what's, and I just want to gently remind that that is not the flex that you think it is, and it is not the helpful politic that you think it is. And I would recommend that you don't do that. So our first question, I would love to hear what you all think around the positioning of South Asian organizations and nonprofits and social workers, because I know we often hear about we need social workers, but not police, but social workers often operate within this kind of carceral structure and can become a tool of the police when we're talking about, you know, community members with mental health issues or folks who are experiencing homelessness. So how do you kind of think about the kind of social work bend towards abolition, as well as thinking about anti-Blackness within nonprofits?
That is a lot of work that we think about. So, you know, one of the trends that we've seen in the last 30 years is that the police state has grown to become, in the US, a massive complex, like a hydra. And there's two dynamics within that. One is that the police have taken on a lot of social functions. So they take on the role of dealing with mental health crisis, with emotional crisis, with housing issues, with domestic abuse. And a complementary dynamic of that is that a lot of the social work functions have become policeized, whatever the right word would be. You know, like teachers, we see like in the surveillance of Muslim communities and the countering violent extremism programs, like teachers are taking on roles of monitoring young people and reporting things. Same thing as you're saying, social workers taking on a role which essentially ends up functioning in other ways like police people. And so the solution is not just like a simply like we'll take money away from the police and like, you know, we'll invest it in social workers. Like it also requires rethinking how those systems operate, how do they relate to each other, and in the very simplest ways, like there has to be like a severance down the middle of cutting off the relationship between the police and those social functions and taking out those policing functions from the social sphere and taking out the social functions from the policing sphere. And that's going to require a lot of experimentation, right? What's going to work. And I think Kathy was hinting at this, that like we still have a lot of learning to do. We're going to try things. We're going to figure out, okay, for this thing, like, is it social workers that'll work? Or is it actually investing in jobs? Is it investing in education? Or, oh, maybe this is actually a housing issue. Like, it's going to take some some experimentation for us to figure out what's going to work. And as we keep succeeding in those, the role of the police will keep getting smaller, smaller, and smaller until it is either completely eliminated or virtually eliminated.
I'd like to add to that, as I actually went to social work school because I was lost in life and I was just buying time. But yeah, the Association for Asian American Studies has already started having conversations around revamping their curriculum to account for this new vocal right within our communities. And so how they teach, one is how they teach in their curriculum, and then two, how they are intentionally engaging international students from China, but also Chinese American students who are being pulled in the right-wing forces. So I think this what your question actually reminds me is all the social workers that are being fed into the system come from the universities and colleges that are training them. And students actually have a lot of power to demand those kinds of changes in their curriculum and how social work is taught, for one thing, and when they're fed into the system, like changing how they actually operate with the police or don't operate the police. And actually, that's actually a good starting point of how they build these models to scale. There's so many social work schools, and I don't know if they're of the 1,000 people watching right now, any of you are social workers or professors in social work universities, but it's actually, that is a good starting place to build and scale models of alternative models to working with the police. And that starts at the local level with the grassroots.
I would just add my 2 cents about that. My mom is actually a social worker. And, you know, I think that, you know, the problem with social work is that the system is embedded within a network of carcerality. So even people that are community organizers that go into that field are only given tons and tons and tons of carceral options. And I think that, you know, domestic violence is a really good example. You know, when you are a survivor that has a visa in question, you cannot apply for that U visa that allows you to get status unless you have a police report. This means every single time, you know, to build your case of abuse, you are trained, you know, especially as someone who's a TV provider, that you have to call the police. You have to have the police weigh in. And I think that, you know, to what Kathy was saying, I think one, you know, non-Black people of color need to understand that when we are in carceral social work systems, our anti-Blackness may be part of where we're contributing to the breaking of Black families and to a system, especially when I think of something like foster care, which is exactly like baby prison in many states. And when you talk to children who've been in foster care, there is an irrevocable violence and pain that also comes from their parents also being caught up in this system. And so we can go into those systems and try to make things better, which is what many people try to do, but it's kind of like you're putting Band-Aid on a cancer. And I think many people try to do that because, you know, there's empathy and there's process. But I think the call for abolition is to push our institutions to demand, you know, if we get city money, let's try something different. Can we create a different protocol that will be acknowledged by the state, that doesn't require the police to be called? You know, those are the questions, like the practical pipeline of carcerality that deals with the question of trauma and harm in our families. If we were to just look at that, and there's actually many, many groups in the country that have already experimented in this within the Black liberation ecosystem, because again, they weren't going to wait for the rest of us, because it's not acceptable to say, yeah, we'll figure that out 20 years from now when people are dying today. So those experiments are here, but what they need to be done is funded to scale. So I think that what would be really great is for people to really think about investing in that powerful idea of what physical community safety looks like that doesn't involve the police, and fund those local experiments. And the more of those experiments that we get, the more that we'll see what will work for a particular locality. Like, this is a time where our radical imaginations can actually dream whatever world that we want, and we need to not listen to people that, and too often in the South Asian community, those are the aunties and uncles, those are the power brokers, those are the people that are part of the caste associations, those are the people that will sit and take a picture with the police to show off that they've made it in the country. Those are the people that are going to try to dampen this call for abolition, and those are the people that you need to say, take 10 seats and then some.
I think might have to wrap up soon. I think for our last question, I think might be the most difficult question. I think on the topic of empathy, you know, it's really important to draw parallels between structures of oppression in the United States and in the diaspora, and then, you know, in our countries of origin. How do we kind of think about drawing these links between communities without erasing the uniqueness of anti-blackness as structure? You know, this person asks, interestingly, and I think that this is important, with South Asian folks showing up for Black folks only after connecting it to their struggle, or only after realizing that, you know, it's a system of oppression that will ultimately hurt them, is that empathy. And so how do we kind of use these tools of radical imagining to build a kind of solidarity that doesn't demand a kind of recentering away from the kind of locus of power or the locus of oppression. Do we need that? Is that necessary? Is that what real solidarity is? How do we, I guess the question is like, how do you define a real, true solidarity word?
I could do like a first stab. You know, in our work in Drum, we think of levels of solidarity. A very first level is like being symbolic solidarity. So that's the things that we say, that's what we write on the signs, that's a social media post that we make. I think it's helpful to not be dismissive or minimalizing of it, but to understand and accept that it's just the first stage. The second is transactional. And transactional is, I think, what you were referencing, which is that like, oh, I'm gonna care for you because that's also in my interest, right? So like we hear the German Niemöller poem, first they came for the Jews and they came for the communists and there was no one for me. So it's really like that sort of framework, which is like, okay, I'm gonna support them because I'll either need them to support me later or because, you know, like sort of supporting them will eventually support me. A level above that is embodied solidarity, where it's people actually start putting their own material interest, their bodies, their money on the line. I think this is probably the one that's most popular amongst activists. This is like a lot of the direct actions of like chaining oneself to the precinct, or like, you know, disrupting police activity or stopping ICE vans. And then the fourth one is, we call it transformative solidarity. And it requires that like people are organized collectively. And it's reorienting the demands of the struggles of our communities to be aligned with the struggles of other communities. So in one way, it does require you to do some work that is centered on yourself and your communities. But the focus is not your own communities. The focus is what kind of system, what kind of world are we building in which it's not just about us, it's about justice for everybody. And so realigning our interests with the interests and the benefits of other communities, even if that means foregoing benefits for our own selves. And I think that the praxis of that in itself generates a kind of consciousness where people actually, it's almost like a mixing of blood, like our blood and our sweat becomes mixed together. And so we understand that like our struggles are interlinked. They're not exactly the same, but they're interlinked in ways that they can't be separated from each other. And if we're gonna move together, we're gonna have to listen and hear and feel out where everybody's at and where we need to go.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that idea of co-liberation, because I feel that that really rings a bell in terms of how my own practical solidarity practice is. Because I'll be really honest, like I feel like for everyone that is listening on this call, that is Dalit, there is nobody here that is not mourning. For everyone here that is Indian Muslim, there is nobody here that's not mourning. And same too that are Adivasis, because I think what this moment and this cry, when we see the United States like erupt into this, rebellion against racial violence, what we're thinking about is that we are in the experience of genocide in India right now. And that, just this week, there were 3 terrible cases of caste atrocity, that we have political prisoners like, Professor Anand Teldumle and Safira Zohra, who is pregnant and in jail by a Hindu nationalist government. And that no matter how much blood that is spilled of our people, no matter how many times we are lynched, nobody says a word. And I think that was what was so profound to me. Was I remember being in a cotton field in India, and it was the site of a caste atrocity where Dalit bodies had been chopped up and spread throughout the field. And I was numb being part of that atrocity intake, but also the feeling of cotton and thinking about, like, you know, so many Black leaders here in the United States who mentored me, who took the time to share with me their experience, and through their words, I saw a pathway to liberation. And mostly because upper caste people don't care about our freedom. They've actually done everything they could to not allow our experience to be free, so that they could be the gatekeepers in post-coloniality, so that they would understand India only in the terms of colony and not in the terms of caste. And if they had seen it in the terms of caste, we would not be talking about Gandhi, we'd be talking about Ambedkar. And the way that we've been robbed in history of the internationalism that we deserve as caste oppressed people, we will not allow this time. We will not allow that silencing, because what we want this time is for impunity of all kinds to stop. And I always remember the way that, you know, my first experience of reading Bell Hooks, or Patricia Hill Collins, or when I first met, you know, Professor Cornel West. Like, he's one of my old mentors, and I remember I was so nervous to meet him. I thought he would be like other people who are American, like, or Indian, when I would bring up issues of caste and they would dismiss me. And he saw me and he said, "I see you." And he's like, you know, I believe I was the first person to teach Ambedkar in Harvard, and I cannot believe I get to meet his daughter here today. And I think this is what I'm talking about in terms of co-liberation. Oppressed people see each other quite clearly. You know, we know that we need each other, and we're the only ones that will hold each other when the state comes for us. And I think that's why we are asking for people, if you have been part of a legacy and a lineage that has led to Black death, you need to be able to aggressively deal with your history, your legacies, but also contribute now. And I say this, like, with my Dalit hat on, and also with my South Asian hat on, like, we have a reckoning with our anti-Blackness. Even caste oppressed people who've been part of indentured communities in the Caribbean and in Fiji and in Africa, you have to keep in mind that Indians held slaves, like in Gujarat, on the east coast of Africa. There were several Indian networks of Gujaratis that were sent back because they were slave owners. But also the way the English actually recreated the caste system, because they found that that was the most effective way to rule conquered peoples. So many of these colored categories that we saw come up in indentureship versus slaves, and how colored people and immigrants from, you know, the Pacific Islands and ourselves were put against indigenous Black tribes and communities. That is the violence process of racialization. And while we all experienced a joint experience of colonialism, there are definitely times that we contributed to anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, because we may have been forced settler colonials, but we were settler colonials. And we see so many aspects of how we can both carry our wounds of colonialism and also atone and deeply change the ways we show up for Black people today by acknowledging that core violence. And that's really this call for action, is that no one is a perfect social justice person. No one has a lineage that's not shaped or marred by conquest or violence. But we have a power to bring empathy and beauty and love and queerness to the equation that changes the way we understand family and kin and possibility and community. And I think that that's why we need to really look at each other and say, you know, when you wake up every morning, what have you done to unlearn your anti-Blackness? And what have you done to approach about abolition today? And if you just ask those two questions, you'll be surprised at the things that you'll end up doing and the future that you'll be welcoming in for your people, your community, and for this moment.
Last but not least, Kathy.
I have nothing to add to them more, but they said it all.
I would just like to thank everyone so much for coming to the conversation. I am really honored and awed of the three of you and the work that you do and the way that it's inspired me. So thank you so much to Fad, to Kathy, to Tanmori. and to Shama, who's not here anymore. But thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for coming through. For further resources, if you're interested, Equality Labs has the South Asians for Black Lives webpage, which has a lot of really great resources about all of these different interlocking oppressions for you to share with your friends and with your family. And I think that this will be online posted, I think.
Oh, but also we want to really thank you, Zoe, for your sharp and powerful moderation and your internationalism. That is really, really incredible. Like, you're a national treasure. We love you so much. And I also want to shout out all of the folks who made this happen, including Moan and Charmin, who are the technical and political whizzes of this, as well as our translators, because, you know, we are working as a community to be able to be more centered around disability justice. And so this is one of our first events where we were able to have ASL, and we'd love to keep being accessible. And everybody who's there, I just want to thank you for coming and being part of our community, because sometimes we might be messy and we're not perfect in the way that we learn, but we don't want perfect. What we want is a movement, and a movement is all about that, like, volatile, beautiful, compassionate, irresistible combustion of possibility. And if we can hold each other with love and compassion and learning, we can get there. And Zoe and Fahad and Kathy and Charmin and Monica, you are all people who hold that politics so well. And so thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us. And as always, in an Ambedkarite space, we end with J Beam. So thank you, everybody, and J Beam.
And thank you, baby. We fight for you.